Hello, boys and girls. Thank you for listening. We're going to continue Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's magic. We are on Chapter 4, The Bad Table Manners Cure. And we've met Christopher Brown, and he has very bad table manners. So Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle has recommended bringing a pig home. Yeah? Lester the pig has come to stay at the Browns. All right, so I think when we left them last, they had just finished their snack and they were going to listen to a radio program at 5 o'clock. Okay, there's a nice little fire laid out and Christopher's listening to his radio show and Lester's laying down on the hearth rug and he closes his eyes. It was very peaceful. When Mr. Brown came home from work, Mrs. Brown told him about the invitation to dinner to meet Mrs. Thompson's famous brother Charles, and about Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, and about Lester. Mr. Brown was most skeptical about Lester being able to teach Christopher table manners. "Talk about the blind leading the blind," he said, and he laughed loudly. Mrs. Brown said, "Hush, Philip. Lester's right in the basement, and really he has the most beautiful table manners I've ever seen." Mr. Brown said, "Well, I guess I'll go down and have a look at Lester." He went down the basement stairs, whistling "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf?" Mrs. Brown groaned. Mr. Brown looked first in the wood room. No Lester. Then he looked in the furnace room and he saw the blue guest room blanket lying on the floor, so he picked it up, shook it, and took it into the laundry and stuffed it in the laundry chute. He went around the laundry, peering under the washing machine, laundry tubs, and ironing board, saying, "Oink, oink, oink." He got no response. He noticed that the basement door was open a little, so he closed and locked it, muttering about burglars and carelessness. Then, hearing the radio from the games room, he decided to go in and ask Christopher where he kept his pig, and he was certainly surprised to see Lester lying on the hearth floor in front of a crackling fire, apparently listening to the radio, and he said, "So, this is Lester! Oink, oink, oink." Lester opened his eyes and gave him a cold look. And then seeing that it was Mr. Brown, he jumped to his feet and held out his hoof. "Well, I'll be darned," said Mr. Brown, shaking hands and beaming. Christopher said, "Boy, isn't Lester smart, Daddy? Isn't he?" Mr. Brown said, "I always said that you can teach a pig anything. Pigs are the smartest animals there are." Lester still looked coldly at him. He hadn't forgiven him for the oink, oink, oink business. Mr. Brown bent over and began scratching Lester behind the ears, and Lester gently but firmly pushed his hand away, and then went down again to lay by the fire. Mr. Brown, slightly red in the face, said, "Well, I guess I better see how dinner is coming along." Christopher said, "Just a minute, Daddy. I want to show you how keen Lester plays ball. Come on, Lester, old boy, let's play a game." He picked up the red tennis ball, and Lester rather unwillingly got to his feet. Christopher threw him the ball, and he caught it in his mouth and threw it back. Christopher threw it again, and Lester caught it, but this time Lester threw it to Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown was so surprised that he almost missed, but you could tell he was pleased because he kept looking at Lester and smiling. They played three-cornered catch until Mrs. Brown called to say dinner was ready and to tell Christopher to wash his hands. There was a small lavatory off the games room, and Christopher rushed in and in his usual way wet his hands, splashed a little water on his face, and was going to wipe all the dirt off on the towel when Lester, who had followed him in, took the towel away from him and put it back on the towel rack, put the stopper in the basin, filled it to the brim with hot water, and began washing his own face and hooves thoroughly and with lots of soap. When he had finished, he let the water out of the basin and filled it up with fresh, hot water for Christopher. While Lester dried his nice clean face and hoof, Christopher washed thoroughly and with lots of soap. While he dried his face and hands, Lester took the hairbrush and dampened and smoothed the bristles on his neck and around his ears, and Christopher watched him, then dampened and brushed his hair too. Then they went up to dinner. Unfortunately, Mrs. Brown, forgetting about Lester, had spare ribs for dinner, and that's a cut of meat from a pig. They were crisp and brown, and Mr. Brown gave Lester an extra large helping, and Lester sat down at the table, smiled because everything looked and smelled so delicious. Oh, excuse me, I've got the yawns. Everything smelled so delicious. He unfolded his napkin, took a sip of milk, and then cut off a small piece of the spare rib. He put it in his mouth, began to chew, and then turned terribly pale and pushed his plate away. Christopher watched him anxiously. "Gosh, Lester, what's the matter? Don't you like spare ribs?" Lester took his spare ribs and put them on Christopher's plate. Christopher said, "Well, Lester, I'll go tell Mother that you don't like spare ribs. She'll fry you some eggs or something. That's what she does for Daddy when he doesn't like something." He started to get down from his chair, and Lester reached over and took hold of his shoulder. He shook his head sternly, pointed to Christopher's dinner, and by chewing motions indicated to Christopher that he was to continue with his dinner. Lester had 2 helpings of dressing, sweet potatoes and string beans, and he also ate his salad, 2 dishes of peaches, 2 pieces of applesauce cake, and drank 4 cups of coffee. Christopher ate all of his dinner, and with much less noise than usual. He even asked Lester if it was all right to pick his spare rib bones up in his fingers. After dinner, he and Christopher and Mr. Brown played ball for a while, and then it was time for Christopher to go to bed. He and Mr. Brown said goodnight to Lester and went upstairs. Lester went to his bed, but it wasn't there. He looked all over the basement, thinking perhaps Mrs. Brown had moved it. He couldn't find it any place, and then he checked to see if the back door had been left open, and he found it shut and locked. He looked again to see if he could find the blanket, and it just wasn't anywhere, so he decided to go upstairs and ask Mrs. Brown where it was. He went up the basement stairs, had quite a time with the basement door, which stuck, trotted through the kitchen and dining room, and then stood politely at the living room door. Mr. and Mrs. Brown were playing cribbage and arguing, so they didn't see Lester for a few minutes, and when Mrs. Brown happened to look up, she said, "Oh, why, Lester, have you come to visit us?" Lester shook his head. And Mrs. Brown said, "What's the matter then? Is it cold down in the basement?" Lester shook his head. "Oh, I know," Mr. Brown said. "You want me to play ball with you, don't you, old boy?" And Lester shook his head. Then, deciding that would be a very good way to get them down to the basement, he nodded his head vigorously several times, and Mr. Brown beamed. "Okay, old boy, come on down, Alice, and watch." Mrs. Brown said she would like to, so they went downstairs. But Lester, in spite of his flawless manners, went first, and instead of going into the game room, he stood by the furnace room door. Mrs. Brown looked in the furnace room. "But where is your blanket?" she said. Lester shook his head, and Mrs. Brown said, "Why, that's the funniest thing. I put the blue guest room blanket on the floor here this afternoon. I wonder what could have happened to it." Do we know what happened to it? We do. Mr. Brown did something with it. Mr. Brown, looking very embarrassed, he went and got it out of the laundry chute. He said, I didn't know it was Lester's bed. I just thought it had fallen on the floor." Mrs. Brown spread it out on the floor, and Lester carefully smoothed out all the wrinkles and turned one corner over just like a little pillow. Mr. and Mrs. Brown watched him in amazement. "I have never in my life seen such a smart animal," said Mrs. Brown. "He's almost human." Lester looked at her quizzically. "Now you're all ready to go to bed, so I guess we'll go upstairs," said Mr. Brown. He started towards the doorway, but Lester took his hooves and gently pushed him towards the basement door. "Now what's the matter, old boy?" said Mr. Brown. "The basement door's locked and there's not a thing to worry about." Mrs. Brown said, "Well, of course that's the trouble. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle told me to be sure and leave the basement door open a crack so Lester can go out into the night and get his exercise." She unlatched the door and opened it 1 inch. Lester nodded approval, waited politely while they preceded him through the doorway, and started up the stairs. Then he went in, lay down on the blue blanket, and went to sleep. The next morning, when Christopher came downstairs and found his mother frying bacon, he was shocked. He said, "My gosh, Mother, don't you have any heart at all? Last night you had spare ribs for dinner, and Lester almost got sick, and now this morning you're cooking bacon?" Mrs. Brown said, "Why, Chris, I thought I had a delicious dinner last night. spare ribs have always been one of your favorite foods. Chris said, but Mother, spare ribs are pork. They come from dead pigs. Mrs. Brown clapped her hand to her mouth and she said, oh, Chris, I didn't even think about that. I'm terribly sorry. Do you think Lester noticed? Chris said, I should say he did notice. He took one bite and then he turned pale and he pushed his plate away. I was going to tell you, but he wouldn't let me. Mrs. Brown said, come hurry before he comes upstairs. Take this bacon up to your father. I'll give you and Lester cereal and scrambled eggs and toast for breakfast. Hurry now, take the bacon to Daddy and I'll air out the kitchen. She opened the back door and shooed the bacon smoke out with her apron so that when Lester came upstairs a few minutes later, the kitchen smelled only of oatmeal and buttered toast. As a usual thing at breakfast, Chris dumped a pitcher of cream on his mush, put on 4 heaping spoons of sugar, then stirred and stirred as though he were mixing cement. When the mush was exactly the right consistency and the correct degree of coolness, he would lift the bowl up to just below his chin and then shovel the mash in as fast as he could swallow. This morning, forgetting about Lester, he began his usual gluttonous proceedings, dumped the entire pitcher of cream in his mush, and was just reaching for the sugar when he looked up and saw Lester looking sadly into the empty cream pitcher. Instantly, he was sorry. Oh, gee, Lester, I didn't mean to be such a pig. Such a glutton. Lester just looked at him and Chris said, I'll go get some more cream. Wait a minute. Lester shook his head. He reached over and picked up Chris's bowl of oatmeal, then carefully poured half the cream on his own cereal. Chris said, well, that's right. We'll each take half. Would you like some sugar? Lester nodded and helped himself carefully to 2 level spoons of sugar, and Chris, who had watched him, did the same. When Christopher started his cement mixer stirring, Lester reached over and took a spoon away and showed Chris how cereal should be eaten. A spoonful at a time, lifted slowly and daintily from the bowl so that each spoonful contained hot cereal, cold cream, and sweet sugar. Chris tried it. And he says, say, Lester, this tastes much better than the old way. Lester nodded and smiled. When Christopher began to scrape his dish, Lester shook his head and pointed to his spoon placed on the plate beside his almost empty dish. When Christopher was eating his scrambled eggs, Lester reached over and closed his mouth 3 times, and he showed him that he must break his toast into small pieces, and then he must not hold the toast in the palm of his hand while putting on jam. He made him put down his milk glass and wipe the milk mustache from his upper lip between sips. Christopher obviously didn't mind these criticisms because he hugged Lester goodbye when he left for school and promised to run all the way home for lunch. It was a beautiful morning, and Mrs. Brown did a large washing. When she went to hang it up on the line, Lester helped her carry the clothes basket of wet clothes from the basement and handed her clothespins as she needed them, and then when the washing was all done, he lay down on the grass in the sun, well hidden from the neighbors by 2 sheets and a tablecloth. Mrs. Brown knelt down and timidly stroked his back. She said, thanks so much for helping with the clothes, Lester, and thank you for helping me with Christopher's manners. I can see a great improvement already. Lester grunted a little. By the night of Dick Thompson's dinner party, Christopher's table manners were absolutely perfect, and the Brown family all loved Lester so much they couldn't even think about his ever leaving. Lester came upstairs with Chris while he bathed and got dressed. He washed Christopher's back and made him wash his ears twice. He made him polish his shoes, and he sent him back to his room for a clean handkerchief. After Christopher had gone, Lester went to the kitchen to wait for his dinner, and noticing immediately that there was no place for him set on the kitchen table, and feeling lonely for Christopher and quite sad, he started to go down to the basement to lie on his blanket. Mrs. Brown called to him. She said, Lester, I thought that as long as Christopher wasn't here, you would like to eat in the dining room with Mr. Brown and me. Lester nodded his head vigorously and trotted happily after her into the dining room. They had a roast of lamb for dinner, and though Lester ate 3 large helpings. His table manners were so beautiful that Mr. and Mrs. Brown just stared at him in admiration. After dinner, Mr. Brown and Lester played catch while Mrs. Brown washed the dishes. Then they all sat in the living room and listened to the radio and waited for Christopher. He came home at 10 o'clock, bursting with excitement and filled with tales of Africa and lions. Everyone listened to his stories, heard about what the Thompsons had to eat and what Uncle Charlie looked like, and then went to bed. The next morning, Mrs. Brown had 2 telephone calls. The first one made her very proud. It was from Mrs. Thompson. And she said that she just had to call Mrs. Brown and tell her that in all her life she had never seen such a beautifully behaved boy as Christopher. His table manners are simply perfect, she said. And Mrs. Brown smiled and smiled. The second telephone call was from Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, and it made Mrs. Brown very sad. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle asked Mrs. Brown how she liked Lester, and Mrs. Brown said, "Oh, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, he has such beautiful manners. He is such a wonderful teacher, and he's so charming that I just feel like crying when I think of all the times I've said that people are pigs or ate like pigs or were selfish like pigs." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Well, of course all pigs aren't like Lester, but he certainly is a dear, and I hate to take him away from you so soon, but I've just had an emergency call from Mrs. Burbank. Tell Christopher to bring Lester over on his way back to school this noon." When Mrs. Brown said goodbye to Lester, she had tears in her eyes, and she thought he seemed a little sad at leaving. That's the last bit of that chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll tune in next time. Chapter 5 is called The Interrupters. Do you know of anybody in your house who might interrupt? Are you an interrupter? Maybe for mommy and daddy, or do you let everybody finish what they have to say? I hope you do. Next time we'll listen to The Interrupters from Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's Magic. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.